Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit the UltraViolet tee. So the first thing you'll need for this project is the free written pattern, which you can get by clicking the first link in the description box down below, or you can grab the ad-free PDF version of the pattern at the second link in the description box down below. But either way, you just need one of the two versions of the pattern. There is a free version and a premium paid version, which is pretty inexpensive. So just grab one of those two versions of the written pattern, and then you can start choosing yarn and your sizing and everything. So this pattern comes in 9 sizes, from a women's extra small all the way to a women's 5X. And to choose a size, you're going to need to measure around the fullest part of the bust and choose the size which most closely matches that measurement. Now this tee is designed with about 6 to 8 inches of positive ease, so it is kind of oversized and loose fitting, but if you want it to be more fitted, you can always size down. Now there are also two versions of this tee. There is a cropped version, which is just slightly cropped. It's supposed to hit at approximately the waistline, according to the Craft Yarn Council's standard measurements. And then there's also a full-length version, which comes below the waist, if you prefer that type of fit. And regardless of which version you choose to make, you can adjust the length of the tee, and the pattern does tell you how and where to do that. It's not very difficult at all. But if you do decide to make it longer than the full-length version of the written instructions, then you will need to buy extra yarn, more than just what it says you need in the pattern. So I'm going to be making the cropped version, and I'm going to be making the size extra small. So once you know which version you're going to make and which size, then you can choose your yarn. Now this pattern calls for a number 3 light or DK weight yarn, and I'm using this yarn from Knit Crate, which is a monthly subscription box. So this is a limited edition yarn. It is Uru Yarn Cotton Basic, and it is a pure organic Pima cotton yarn. Now, chances are pretty good that you will not have this yarn because it was a limited edition yarn from a subscription box, but you can substitute any yarn you like that is in the number 3 light or DK weight category. So just choose a DK weight or number 3 light yarn, and pretty much any yarn will be suitable as long as it is soft and pliable and kind of smooth. I would not recommend a fuzzy yarn for this unless you just really like the fuzzy look, but I'm going for a garment that can be worn during the summer as well as during other parts of the year. So because I want mine to be able to be used in the summer, I am using this smooth Pima cotton that has no surface fuzz whatsoever. If you've seen my video on choosing the best yarns for summer garments, then you probably already realize that you definitely do not want a yarn that has any kind of fuzz to it for a summer project. So I'm using this Pima cotton yarn, but like I said, you can use any number 3 light or DK weight yarn that you like. And the pattern will tell you how much yarn that you need for any of the sizes that you want to make in both the cropped version and the full-length version. So the other things you'll need are the knitting needles, and this is a circular knitting needle, not because we're knitting in the round, we are only knitting back and forth in rows, but we are knitting a rather wide piece, so we do need a circular knitting needle to be able to hold all of those stitches, as opposed to if you had like a 10 or 12 inch straight needle and you tried to cram all those stitches onto the length of that needle, you'd have a really hard time doing that. So this is why we want a circular needle, and I am using a US size 7 or 4.5 millimeter knitting needle here. And you want one that's at least 30 inches long. And just remember that it's more important to choose a needle size that gets you the gauge for the pattern instead of just using the size that the pattern calls for and just going with that. You have to check your gauge first anytime you make a garment. So don't just use the exact same size that I'm using just because that's what the pattern says. Make sure you check your gauge and use the needle size that will give you the correct gauge for the pattern. So you'll also need some scissors, a measuring tape, and a yarn needle or a blunt tapestry needle. I have some chibi bent tipped needles here, and those are mainly going to be for seaming and weaving in the ends. And just real quick before we get started, here is a sample of the fabric. This is actually my gauge swatch, and you will be asked to make a gauge swatch in the written instructions, and I highly recommend that you do that. Please don't skip this step. It is super important to make sure that not only your garment fits correctly, but also to make sure that you don't run out of yarn, because if your gauge is too loose and it ends up being bigger than what the pattern calls for, you could end up running out of yarn even if you have the correct amount of yarn for the size that you're making. So do not skip this step. Please make a gauge swatch. Even if you end up having to unravel it later, it's really important to make a gauge swatch to make sure that your garment turns out the way that it should. But this is just a sample of the stitch pattern that we're using. The finished fabric here is very loose and drapey and delicate and lightweight. So now that we have all of our supplies, we can get on with the knitting. So we're making two panels here that are basically a modified rectangle. We're making one piece for the front and one piece for the back. And when we're going to start at the bottom and knit up, and when we get to the place where the armholes and the sleeves are going to begin, we're going to cast on extra stitches for the width on both sides to add width for the sleeves, and then continue knitting up from there. But we are going to, before we get started, we're going to leave a few yards of yarn tail so that we can use that for seaming later. So I just like to kind of roll my yarn tail up and get it out of the way so that it is not getting all tangled up every time you turn the work and etc. So I just kind of roll it up, wrap the yarn around the middle of that roll a couple of times, and then just kind of twist a loop of yarn and tighten that around, because that can easily be undone, but it still holds it securely and keeps it from unwinding as it's dangling from the bottom of your project. So I'm going to go ahead and start by making a slip knot, and we're going to be using the knitted cast on for this project. Now, it's not that the knitted cast on is absolutely required, but because we're going to need a cast on later that you can work in the middle of your project for when we add stitches for the sleeves, we're just going to use the same cast on for the whole thing just to keep it simple. And this cast on is actually pretty easy to work. If you can make a knit stitch, you can do this. So this does not require any kind of long tail. We are leaving a long tail, but that is for seaming only. It's not actually making the cast on. So I'm going to grab one end of my needle here. I just kind of like to hold the other one out of the way, because if I don't, then it bangs on the table while I'm talking and you can hear that. So I've got my slip knot on the needle, and essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to knit into the stitch that's already there, and then that creates a new stitch, of course, and then we're going to put it on. Then we're going to knit into that one and put it on the needle. So I have my working yarn in my left hand here, and I'm tensioning it in my left hand. If you are an English style or other type of knitter where that you hold the yarn in your right hand, feel free to do that, but I prefer to hold my yarn in the left hand. And we're basically just going to insert the right needle into the slip knot, knit through that, and then instead of lifting the old stitch off the needle, we're going to lift that new stitch up and bring it down over the left needle. Since it's already inserted into that stitch, we're going to just knit through that, lift it up, bring it over the left needle. We're going to knit through that new stitch, lift it up, bring it over the left needle. So this is how we're adding stitches to create our cast on edge. And this edge does have a decent amount of stretch in it. So this will be a good cast on for starting a garment with. So again, every time I bring a new stitch down over the needle, my right needle is already inserted into that stitch as if to knit. So I can just knit through it, kind of tug on it a little bit, lift up the new stitch and bring it down over the tip of the left needle. And I've already got my needle inserted as if to knit, so I can just grab the yarn again, pull it through, lift up the new stitch, and bring it down onto the left needle. And this can become pretty quick once you get the hang of it. So for the size that I'm making, which is the women's extra small, I'm going to cast on 79 stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to cast on all 79 stitches, and then I'll show you how we're going to start with the first few rows. Alright, so as you can see, I have finished casting on all the stitches for the size that I'm making. And so now we're going to begin the knitting part. So we're going to start with a narrow band of garter stitch. So we are going to, for rows 1 to 4, we're just going to knit every stitch all the way across. So we're just knitting every single stitch in the row all the way to the end, and that's what we're going to do for the first 4 rows, rows 1 to 4. So I'm going to go ahead and just knit across for rows 1 to 4, and then I'll show you how we're going to start working our stitch pattern. Alright, so I've got my first 4 rows of just plain knit stitch, and now we're going to move on to the lace stitch pattern. Now this is not a super complicated lace, it's only a small repeat, and the stitches that we're using are not super complicated, and I'm going to break those down for you so that you can see exactly how we're doing this. So basically everything in knitting is based on knit and purl, and then there are just a couple other very simple things that you can do besides knit and purl, and the combinations of those different stitches is what you can use to make lace. So we're going to be repeating a little sequence across this first row of the stitch pattern, which is row 5. And what we're going to do is we're going to be using a couple of those extra or kind of special stitches besides knit and purl to create the openness of the lace. So the first stitch in our sequence is to knit 1. We've knit the first stitch in our row. And the next thing that we're supposed to do according to the pattern is yarn over. Now yarn over is what makes the little holes, the intentional holes or eyelets in the fabric, and that's what makes our lace pattern. So a yarn over is very easy to work, and it adds a stitch. And to do a yarn over, we're just going to take this right needle and bring it behind the working yarn so that the working yarn is coming from the bottom of the needle. It's coming over the front and then around the back. That's a yarn over. Now if you are holding the yarn in your right hand, which I'm not very good at because I never ever do it this way, then you would just bring the yarn in front of your needle, and since the yarn is in your right hand, it will just kind of stick off into your right hand. But when you go to knit the next stitch, then it will come down around the back of the needle. So I'm going to take the yarn back into my left hand here and work that yarn over so that the yarn is coming over the top of my needle from front to back. And then the next stitch in our sequence is called SSK, and that stands for slip, slip, knit. Now what we're going to be doing here is, because a yarn over adds a stitch, every time we work a yarn over, we also have to work a decrease that goes with it to remove the extra stitch that we added. So when we add a yarn over, like we just did, we have to work a decrease along with it, and SSK or slip, slip, knit is a decrease stitch. So it removes a stitch. So for SSK, we're going to insert the right needle into the next stitch as if to knit, but we're not going to knit it. We're just going to slide it over to the right needle. That's called slipping a stitch as if to knit. Then we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to slip the next stitch as if to knit by inserting the right needle into that next stitch as if we were going to knit into it, but we're not actually going to knit into it. We're just going to slip it over to the right needle. So basically what that does is that kind of reorients those two stitches so that when we work them together in just a second, they will lay the correct direction. So we've got our yarn over back here, then we've slipped those two stitches as if to knit. Now we're going to take the left needle tip and insert it into the front of those two stitches like so. So our needles are now making an X through those two stitches, and the left needle is in the front of that X, and then we're just going to knit through both of those as though they were one stitch. So I'll show you that again in a minute when we do the next repeat of our little sequence. So we have knit 1, yarn over, SSK, which is that slip, slip, knit. Then we're going to knit 1 stitch, and now we're going to knit 2 together. And knit two together is very simple. We're just going to, instead of inserting our needle into the next stitch as if to knit and knitting through it, we're going to insert our needle into 2 stitches at the same time and then knit through both of those as though they were one stitch. So that's a knit two together, which is also a decrease because we're going to add another yarn over right here. So our sequence is knit 1, yarn over, SSK, knit 1, knit 2 together, yarn over. So because we're going to repeat that sequence all the way across until we have 1 stitch left in the row, we're going to do it again. We're going to knit 1, then we're going to yarn over, and now we're going to do that SSK again. So we're going to slip as if to knit, slip as if to knit, then we're going to take the left needle and insert it into the front of both of those stitches that we just slipped, and then knit through both of those as though they were 1 stitch. That's our SSK. Then we're going to knit 1 stitch and knit 2 together, which is just to insert the needle into 2 stitches at once and knit through both of them together, and then yarn over. So again, we're going to knit 1, yarn over, SSK, through those next 2 stitches. Then we're going to knit 1 and knit 2 together, and then work another yarn over. So basically those decreased stitches aren't really any more difficult to work than regular knits and purls. It's just that sometimes it can be a little tricky to insert the needle into 2 of them at once. But as long as your tension or your gauge is not too tight, that shouldn't be super hard. The main thing is that you just want to get through it without splitting the yarn. And that is usually not too hard to do. So we're going to continue repeating that little sequence all the way across of knit 1, yarn over, SSK, knit 1, knit 2 together, and yarn over. And we're going to repeat that little sequence all the way across until we have 1 stitch left in the row. Alright, so I'm down to that last stitch, and I'm just going to knit the last stitch of the row. So we have the beginnings of our lace stitch pattern coming together here. And if you are not sure whether you're comfortable with lace or not, I am going to show you a little trick you can use to kind of hold your place in case you make a mistake. It makes it a lot easier to unravel back if you do find a mistake in your knitting. So that is row 5. And for rows 6, 8, 10, and 12, we're going to purl all the way across. So basically every time we turn over and we work on the other side, the back side of the fabric, we're going to purl all the way across. So for row 6, I'm just going to purl every stitch across. But real quick, I want to show you what it looks like to purl into a yarn over. So I already did one of them, but I'm just going to get one a little further up here so you can see it better. So this is what a yarn over looks like on the back of the work. And basically, just like all the rest of the stitches, even though there's a hole underneath it, it still has a strand of yarn that's sitting in front of the needle. So we're still going to purl through the strand of yarn that's on the front of the needle. So I'm going to purl every single stitch all the way across. And the reason that we do this is because you cannot work lace patterning on every single row. It looks so much better, and it's a lot easier to do when you work the patterning as far as the more complicated things on one side of the work, and then you do a plain row on the other side. So we're just going to purl all the way across for every row that's on the back side of the work. Alright, so I have purled all the way across. That's the end of row 6. And now we're going to move on to row 7. So for row 7, we're going to again work a little sequence that goes all the way across our row up to the last stitch. And so for our sequence in row 7, we are going to knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, and then we're going to work a stitch that is abbreviated as SK2P. Now this might sound really complicated, but it's not that hard to do. It's just a multi-step stitch. So the S in the SK2P stands for slip. So we're going to slip a stitch as if to knit by inserting our right needle into the stitch as if we were going to knit into it, but we just slip it over. We slipped one as if to knit. Then the K2 stands for knit two together, so we're going to knit 2 stitches together, just like we normally would when the pattern tells us to do that. And then the P stands for pass over. So we're going to take our left needle, insert it into the stitch we slipped, which is right here, right before the knit 2 together, and we're going to lift it up over the knit 2 together and off the end of the needle to create what is a double decrease, which means that that gets rid of 2 stitches at the same time. So when we knit 2 together, that gets rid of a stitch, but then when we take the slipped stitch and pass it over, that gets rid of a second stitch. So that is the SK2P. I'll show you that again in just a minute. So we've got knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, SK2P, then knit 1, yarn over. So that's our sequence. Let's do it again. We're going to knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, and then here's our SK2P again. So we're going to slip the stitch as if to knit, that's the S. Then the K2 is for knit 2 stitches together. And then we're going to do the P, which is to pass the slip stitch over the tip of the needle, which is kind of like binding off a stitch, if you're familiar with that, which you probably are. So that's our SK2P, and then we're going to knit 1 and yarn over. So let me just show you that one more time. We're going to knit 1, yarn over, knit 1. Then here comes that SK2P again, S, K2, which is the knit 2 together, and then pass it over, which is the P. Then we're going to knit 1 and yarn over. So we're going to repeat that little sequence all the way to the end of the row until we have 1 stitch left. Alright, so I'm almost to the edge here, but I just wanted to show you real quick what you can do to make your SK2P look a little bit neater. And usually the top stitch of this SK2P gets a little bit loose. So what I like to do is kind of lift up my right needle from it a little bit and then just kind of tug on the working yarn to just snug it up against the needle. Not tight, but just a little bit less loose. So that was my SK2P, knit 1, yarn over. That's the end of my sequence, and we're down to the last stitch. So now I'm going to knit that last stitch. Now if you've never knitted lace before, what I should explain here is that when we knit lace, although we are adding stitches with yarn overs and taking away stitches with the decreases, our stitch count in the whole row does not change. We are only decreasing to compensate for the yarn overs so that we make sure that once we've finished, we haven't actually added or taken away any stitches from our row. So when I say that the SK2P takes away 2 stitches, that doesn't mean that you should have 2 fewer stitches in your row. It just compensates for the yarn overs that we're adding. So don't worry about the decreases in the yarn overs adding shape, because they are not supposed to do that. We are always supposed to have a consistent stitch count through the whole section of this piece. The only time our stitch count will change is when we add stitches for the sleeves, which we will not be doing with increases or decreases. So that is the end of row 7, and because the next row is on the back, which is row 8, I'm just going to purl every stitch all the way across. Alright, so that's the end of row 8. I just purled all the way across, and you can kind of see our stitch pattern beginning to form there. You can see the holes in the fabric. Those are intentional holes, by the way, so they should be there. And now let's work row 9. So for row 9, we're again going to be working a sequence all the way across the row, and that is to knit 1, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, and then SSK. So we're going to slip, slip, and then knit them both together. So that is our sequence for the row. Again, we're going to knit 1, then we're going to knit 2 stitches together, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, S, S, K. And that is the sequence we're going to be repeating all the way across. So I'm going to continue doing that. Knit 1, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, S, S, K. And I'm going to repeat that all the way across until I have 1 stitch left in my row. Alright, I'm down to the last stitch. I'm going to knit that last stitch, and that's the end of row 9. So now I'm just going to work row 10, which is to purl all the way across. Alright, so the next row is row 11, which is the last patterned row. So let's go ahead and work that one. So for row 11, we're going to start our row with a knit 2 together, but that is not part of the sequence we're going to be repeating. So for the sequence, we are going to knit 1, yarn over twice, so we just did knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, and then we're going to do that SK2P. So we're going to slip the first stitch, then we're going to knit 2 together and pass the slipped stitch over. And again, I like to kind of just give a slight tug on the yarn to snug up that stitch against the needle so it's not real loose, because sometimes those can tend to be very stretched out and make a big loose stitch in your knitting. So that's the end of our sequence. Again, we're going to knit 1, yarn over twice. So we're going to do that again, knit 1, yarn over. Then we're going to knit 1 and S, K2, P. Give that a little tug. Knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, S, K2, P. So that is our sequence we're going to be working for this row, and we're going to continue doing that across until 5 stitches are left in the row. Alright, so I've repeated that sequence until I have 5 stitches left in the row. So I'm going to knit 1, yarn over twice. So I'm going to do that again, knit 1, yarn over. Then I'm going to knit 1 and SSK for the last 2 stitches. So S, S, K. We'll knit those 2 together that way. And then that is the end of row 11. So now we're just going to turn and work row 12, which is to purl all the way across. Alright, so that is the end of row 12, and that's the end of our repeat. We're going to be repeating rows 5 to 12 to continue making our lace stitch pattern. Now, before I go on about what we're going to do as far as how far we're going to repeat that, I want to show you a little tip first. This is especially handy if you're not real sure whether you're comfortable with lace knitting or not. You can save your spot and put in like a placeholder every time you finish a repeat of the stitch pattern, so that if you do make a mistake, you can unravel back to the beginning of that repeat, and you don't have to like unravel the whole thing or try to find some way to fix the mistake in the fabric, because sometimes that's really difficult. So one thing you can do is add a lifeline. Now a lifeline is basically a strand of yarn, a different yarn, not the same yarn you're using, that runs through all the stitches on your needle, so that if you need to unravel, you can unravel back to that string, put all the stitches on the string back on the needle, and just pick up from there. That will also help you know if you do have to unravel where to start knitting in the stitch pattern again, because if you just unravel back to some random place in the stitch pattern, you might not know which row you're on or where to start with the instructions. So what you're going to do to add that lifeline is, once you've finished a repeat, so basically once you finish row 12, you're going to grab a length of extra yarn, a different kind of yarn than the one you're using. I recommend a smooth, thin yarn that's kind of strong, like maybe a piece of cotton crochet thread or something like that, but whatever you have works fine. It's usually better to use something thinner than your actual yarn, though, if you are using like a sock weight yarn. So I have a short length of waist yarn here because I'm not actually going to throw in a lifeline right here. But if you are going to do the entire lifeline, what you're going to need is a piece of yarn that is longer than the width of your whole piece, with a few extra inches on each side, preferably at least 6 inches on each side. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to leave all the stitches on the needle where they're at. But with your length of waist yarn and your yarn needle, you're just going to insert your needle into the front strand of every stitch on your needle all the way across the row. So I'm going to just kind of pull through right there, and then do a few more. And we're basically just creating something that's going to hold those stitches from unraveling past this point. So if I were to run a lifeline all the way across my row here. Then if I make a mistake on the next set of rows, the next stitch pattern repeat, then I could just take it off the needles, unravel back to the place where the string is holding all these stitches securely, and then that way I would not have to worry about where I'm stopping in the pattern or if I drop any stitches, because they will all be held on this length of yarn. So then when I need to, I can just come back and put all of the stitches that are on the waste yarn back onto the needles after I've unraveled back to this length of yarn. And then if you do that every time you finish row 12, then you'll know that if you have to unravel back to that string, then you'll start with row 5 on the instructions. Now, you don't have to put a lifeline every single time you get to row 12 and you finish row 12, but what you can do is once you have finished the entire next repeat and you get to row 12 the next time, and you check and make sure that it all looks good, you don't have like mistakes in the fabric anywhere, then you can remove the lifeline you have and just move it up to the next place where you've just finished row 12. And that way, if you do find that you've made a mistake, you can always just unravel back to that lifeline, and it will not cause any more problems for your project because it will securely hold all of those stitches. So I'm not actually going to put a lifeline in here, but if you needed to do that, then that is how you would go about it. But what we're going to do is we're going to continue repeating rows 5 to 12 to create the rest of the length in the section of our panel that goes from the bottom edge of the T to the base of where the sleeve is going to start sticking out to the side. So for the cropped version, I'm going to repeat rows 5 to 12 5 more times. But if you are making the full length version, you'll repeat rows 5 to 12 9 more times. And if you're doing like a custom length and you want to make it extra long, then you would just continue repeating rows 5 to 12 until it is the length that you would like it to be from the hem to the top of the needles, which is going to be where the base of the sleeve starts. Now keep in mind that the base of the sleeve is not right at the underarm because this is an oversized fit tee, so the armholes are kind of longer. It's more of a loose fitting wide sleeve. So where we stop and start adding width for the sleeves is not going to be right at the underarm of where, like, say the armhole of a t-shirt would begin. So I would suggest measuring the length of the finished garment in the pattern instructions against the wearer and see how you like how that length will fall. And then if you want to add more length to that, then you could repeat this section of rows 5 to 12 a few extra times if you wanted to. So I'm going to repeat rows 5 to 12 5 more times for the cropped version, and then I'll show you how we're going to start adding width for the sleeves. All right, so we've got our body panel knit to the point where we're going to start widening for the sleeves. So over the next 2 different rows, we're going to cast on stitches at the end of each of the next 2 rows. So the rows themselves are basically just like the stitch pattern that we've been working, but at the end of the row we're going to add some more stitches with the knitted cast on. But just real quick, first I wanted to show you kind of what this stitch pattern looks like. And once this is blocked, you'll be able to see it much better because blocking helps to open up lace, and it just really helps improve the look and feel of the fabric, particularly with lace. So this is what our stitch pattern is looking like so far. And we're ready to move on to row 13. So for row 13, we're going to knit 1, yarn over, S, S, K, knit 1, knit 2 together, yarn over. And we're going to repeat that sequence all the way across until we have 1 stitch left. Knit 1, yarn over, S, S, K, knit 1, knit 2 together, yarn over. So I'm going to do that all the way across my row till I have 1 stitch left. Alright, there's my last stitch. I'm going to knit the last stitch. And then with the knitted cast on, we're going to cast on 24 more stitches. So to do that, we're going to have to turn the work so that the needle with all the stitches on it is in the left hand. And then with that knitted cast on, we're going to cast on more stitches. So there's 1, 2, and I'm just going to slide them down the needle so they fit better. 3, and we're just casting on with that knitted cast on to continue to add more stitches in the middle of a row. We're kind of at the end of the row, but meaning we don't have to have like a long tail for a long tail cast on or anything like that. We can just cast on at the end of our row and add more stitches to the end of the row. So I'm going to continue casting on until I have cast on 24 more stitches than what we already had. Alright, so there's my 24 more stitches that we've added on. Now this might not look like very much width added for the sleeves, but because this is oversized, the rest of the top will come over the shoulder a little bit, so that will also add to or contribute to part of the length of the sleeve. Alright, so now we're ready to move on to row 14. So for row 14, we are going to purl all the way across and then cast on stitches at the end of the row. So I'm just going to purl every stitch across, and then we will cast on the rest of the extra stitches for the sleeve on the other side. Alright, so there's the end of my row right there. And we're again going to turn the work this way so that the right side is facing and the left needle has all the stitches on it. And now we can, again with the knitted cast on 24 new stitches by inserting into the first stitch that's already on the needle, knitting into it and taking that new loop and putting it on the needle, and continuing to cast on more stitches with this technique. Alright, so there are my 24 extra stitches for the width of the sleeve. And now we're just going to continue working our stitch pattern up further to add more length. So for rows 15 to 20, we're going to repeat rows 7 to 12. And then we're going to repeat rows 5 to 12 several more times to add the full length of where the armhole should be to make the sleeves wide enough and to make sure that we have enough depth in the armhole. So after you have worked rows 15 to 20, which is to repeat rows 7 to 12, then when we repeat rows 5 to 12 again, the number of times you're going to repeat it will depend on which size that you're making. But for the size that I'm making, which is the extra small, I'm going to repeat rows 5 to 12 7 more times. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat those rows, and then I'll show you what the piece looks like at that point, and we'll move on to the final edging and the bind off. Alright, so I've finished repeating those rows, and you can see how at this point we have the sleeves extending off from our panel. And although this one looks kind of short, that's because this is the cropped version. So it is only the standard length from back of neck to waist instead of extending below the waist. But of course the full length version is included in the pattern, and you can also adjust the length so that it is however long you want it to be. And it kind of looks right now as though that the piece kind of gets narrower up here. It really doesn't. It's just because the edges of the lace have curled slightly. But lace edges don't curl anywhere near as much as stockinette stitch, so we don't have to worry about doing anything about that curl, because once we block this, the lace fabric will open up very nicely and the curl will disappear because it's only slight around the edges. So the next step is we're going to go ahead and repeat rows 1 to 4, which is just to knit across every row, and then I'll show you how to bind off. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat rows 1 to 4, which is just knit for 4 rows basically, and then I'll show you how we're going to bind off. Alright, so I've repeated rows 1 to 4, and you can see how we've got a little bit of a garter stitch edging up here now to match what we started with at the beginning. And now we're just going to bind off our panel all the way across. So you can use the ordinary bind off technique if you like, which is just to knit the first 2 stitches, pass the first stitch over the second one, knit the next stitch, pass the first stitch over the second one. And if you can do this loosely without it being too tight, then go ahead and use that technique. But if you have a hard time doing it loosely, then you might want to go check out my how to bind off loosely video, which shows the suspended bind off, which is a slight variation on the typical bind off method that keeps it from being too loose. So for the suspended bind off, we knit the next stitch, pass the first stitch over the second one, and leave it on the left needle tip while we knit the next stitch, lift both of them off at the same time, pass the first stitch over the second one, leaving it on the needle tip, and then knit the next stitch, lifting both of them off at the same time. So that's a way of going about it that can produce a looser bind off if you have a hard time binding off loosely. But regardless, we just want to bind off loosely so that our bind off edge is not too tight and will not be restricting the stretch of the edge very much. So I'm going to go ahead and bind off all the way across my row, and then I'm going to leave a tail for seaming, kind of long but not super long. And then I'm going to repeat all of the instructions for this first panel to make the second panel, which is identical to the first one. And once I have both of my panels made and bound off, then I'm going to show you how we're going to sew it together. Alright, so now both of my panels are finished and they have been blocked. And now the next step is to seam them together. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take one of these panels and place it right side down so that the back of the work is facing up. And then I'm going to take the other panel and place it right side up on top of the first one so that the back sides of both of these panels, the purl sides, are on top of each other. So we're just going to roughly line those up, but we want to make sure that the cast on edges are at the bottom, like so, and they are roughly lined up, and we're going to start sewing a side seam. So here is our side seam. We have the actual seam that goes up the side of the T, and then there is a little bit of an extension of that seam where the underside of both sleeves, front and back sleeve, will be sewn together. So down here at the bottom of one of my panels, at the bottom corner, I have this long yarn tail that I was saving for the seam. I'm going to thread it into my yarn needle. And then starting at the base of this seam, we're basically just going to mattress stitch these front and back edges together up to the corner. And then we're going to whip stitch these edges together up to this corner. So starting at the bottom, I'm just going to take one stitch right across to secure and line up the very, very corners of our panels. So now we're just going to begin with the mattress stitch, joining these two edges together. And if you're not familiar with mattress stitch, I do have a video on this method of joining two knitted panels together. And this is the best way that I know of to make a clean, straight, smooth seam where that you cannot really see the seam at all. So for mattress stitch, basically what we're doing, let me get past the little garter stitch section so that you can see it better. But on each side we are coming over from the other side, we're coming across the gap, and we're coming to the edge of the stitch column here, and we are grabbing two horizontal strands from between the first stitch column and the second one. Now with this stitch pattern we do have some yarn overs and some other stitches that run right up against the edge. So you won't always be able to grab exactly just the ladder strands between the stitch columns, but just do the best you can. And if you would rather not use the mattress stitch for this particular seam, if you don't want to do it on lace, then you can whip stitch it from the inside if you want to. That works fine as well. But mattress stitch, in my opinion, does give a cleaner seam than a whip stitch. But if you want to use a whip stitch, go right ahead. It won't show that much. So you can use whatever seaming method that you like. I'm just going to be using the mattress stitch and coming in between those stitch columns and grabbing those ladder strands. And like I said, I have a video on mattress stitch if you're interested in that. I'll link it down below. So I'm just going to mattress stitch these two edges together until I reach the corner up here where the sleeve begins to stick out the side. Alright, so I finished mattress stitching up to the corner up here, and you can see how the seam kind of disappears into the fabric where you don't even really see it. And so now that I've reached this corner where the sleeve splits off to the side, now we're just going to whip stitch this edge together. So I'm just going to kind of hold it upside down like this so that I can see the seam here, and just make a whip stitch, which is kind of an around and around stitch. And like I said, you can use the whip stitch for the side seam, the lower part of the side seam if you want to. But I'm just going to keep making stitches that go around both cast on edges of this sleeve portion. And I'm going to continue stitching it in this manner until I get to where the two edges stop, this is the opening for the sleeve. So I'm going to get to this corner right here with my whip stitch, and then we'll tie off and move on to the next seam. Alright, so I am just about down to this very edge at the sleeve here. And I want to make sure that I don't stop before I get to the real corner, because if I stop right here, you can see there's kind of like a little divot in the edge right here. That's because there's still one more stitch on each side that I need to pick up in my seam. But once I've got that last stitch and I've stitched those together right there, then the seam edge right here where the seam runs into the edge of the knitting kind of just has a seamless straight edge look to it. So we're going to take one more stitch through the same space again, wrap the yarn around the needle, and pull it through to make a knot. Alright, so there is our first side seam, and here is up here the upper edge of the T. Here is our sleeve and side edge down here, and this is our sleeve opening. So normally I would weave in this tail, and I am going to weave in this tail, but for right now I'm just going to leave 6 to 8 inches and cut off the extra, and I'm going to weave it in later because right now I want to show you real quick how to do the shoulder seam. So basically what you would do is you're going to take what we did right here for this seam, and you're going to do the same thing on the other side of the T. You're going to do the same thing in this area, and then again tie off and weave in the tails. And then up here we're going to do our shoulder seam. So for the shoulder seam we are whip stitching the bind off edges of our two panels together. So I'm going to take this shorter tail. It's fairly decent length, but it's not as long as the other one. And this one is at the top corner, and we're just going to begin to whip stitch our corner together right there. And then we're just going to come in each of these bind off edge stitches and take a stitch through those. And I'm going to continue stitching these pairs of bind off edge stitches together with a whip stitch until my seam is a certain length. Now the length of your shoulder seam should depend on which size you're making, so refer to the pattern instructions to know how long to sew this up for the size that you're making. But for the extra small, which I'm making, I need to stitch this seam until the seam is approximately 10 inches long. So I'm going to go ahead and continue stitching these edges together until my seam is 10 inches long, and then we'll tie off. Alright, so my seam is 10 inches long. I'm going to take one more stitch right where I just was, and then wrap the yarn around the needle, pull it through to make a knot, and then I will weave in this tail. So you're also going to do the same thing on the other side. So here is the shoulder seam at the top, and then once you've already done the side seam on this side, then you'll do the shoulder seam on this side as well, and there will be a gap left in the middle, which is the neck opening. So I'm going to finish up the two seams on the other side of my T, weave in all my tails, and then my T will be finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make this project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.